Chapter 1. The Myth of Willpower. There is a particular kind of failure that hurts more than most. It is not the failure that comes from ignorance, from never trying, from never caring. It is the failure that arrives after you have tried your hardest, wanted it deeply, announced it publicly, and still ended up exactly where you began. This kind of failure does not just leave you without the result you wanted, it leaves you with a story about yourself, a story that says you are someone who cannot change. And that story, once it takes root, is far more dangerous than whatever habit you were trying to break in the first place. Most people have lived this. You have probably lived this. The moment arrives, some version of rock bottom or fresh clarity, and you decide with full sincerity that things are going to be different. Maybe it is the 1st of January, and you feel the symbolic clean slate of a new year pressing against your chest. Maybe it is a doctor's appointment where the numbers on the chart finally frightened you. Maybe it is a conversation you had with someone you love, or a photograph that shocked you, or simply a quiet Tuesday afternoon where you looked at your life and felt the unbearable weight of everything that had gone unchanged. Something shifts. Something in you rises up and says, "Enough. This time will be different." And for a while, it is. You feel the momentum of your own decision. You feel the pride of early action. The morning workouts, the meals you planned, the social media you avoided, the money you saved. You feel for the first time in a long time like someone who is in control of their own life. The first week is exhilarating. You tell people. You feel the social weight of your commitment pressing you forward. You genuinely believe that this time the change will stick. And then, quietly and without drama, it stops. Not all at once. The unraveling is never all at once. It is gradual. A skipped morning here, a rationalized exception there. A week that was unusually hard and somehow never recovered from. The gym visits thin out. The savings disappear into small pleasures. The old patterns return one by one like guests who were never really asked to leave, who just waited politely in the hallway. And weeks later, or months later, you realize you are back. Not just back to where you started, but back with something new added. One more piece of evidence that you are the kind of person who starts and does not finish, who wants and does not achieve, who tries and does not succeed. This is perhaps the most widespread and least discussed form of human suffering. Not the dramatic failures, not the visible catastrophes, but this quiet, grinding, repetitive experience of being unable to become who you want to be. And what makes it so corrosive is not just the failure itself, but the explanation we have been handed for it. The explanation goes like this. You failed because you lacked willpower. You did not want it badly enough. You were not strong enough, disciplined enough, committed enough. The person who succeeds is the person who simply decides to do it and does it. You, for reasons that must be personal and internal and rooted in some weakness of character, did not. This explanation is everywhere. It is woven into the cultural fabric of how we talk about self-improvement, success, and human potential. It shows up in the language of gym culture and diet culture, in motivational speeches and productivity books, in the advice of well-meaning friends and the inner voice that lectures you at midnight. Just do it. No excuses. Mind over matter. Where there is a will, there is a way. The implication in all of it is the same. The only thing standing between you and the life you want is the strength of your own desire. And if you have not changed, you simply did not want it enough. But here is what decades of behavioral science have quietly and consistently discovered. This explanation is wrong, not partially wrong, not oversimplified, fundamentally, structurally wrong, and more than that, it is harmful. Because when you believe that willpower is the engine of change, every failure becomes a referendum on your character. Every lapse becomes proof of a personal deficiency. And so people who have already failed once become even less likely to try again because the cost of another failure is not just the lost result, it is another wound to their already bruised sense of who they are. Let's sit with the willpower idea for a moment because it deserves serious examination before we discard it. Willpower, as most people understand it, is the conscious mental force that overrides desire. You want the cake, but you choose not to eat it. You want to stay in bed, but you force yourself up. You want to scroll through your phone, but you put it down. In this model, the person with strong willpower is someone who consistently and reliably chooses the hard right thing over the easy wrong thing through sheer conscious effort. The assumption underneath this model is that every behavioral decision passes through the same conscious gate, that you are, at every moment, the deliberate author of your own actions. This assumption feels intuitively true. When you reflect on your own behavior, it seems obvious that you are making choices. You notice yourself reaching for the biscuit and then either stopping or not stopping. The stopping feels like a conscious act of strength. The not stopping feels like a conscious act of surrender. From the inside, every action appears to be a decision. But this feeling of authorship, this sense that you are consciously driving every moment of your day, turns out to be one of the most persistent and consequential illusions in human psychology. Research in behavioral science has shown that an astonishing proportion of what we do every single day, not occasionally, not sometimes, but consistently, is not consciously decided at all. It is automatic. It runs on a system that operates below the level of deliberate thought, triggered by the contexts we are in and the patterns we have built over time through repetition. We go through enormous swathes of our day on a kind of quiet autopilot, driving familiar routes, eating familiar foods, responding to familiar triggers, without ever really deciding to. The thinking mind believes it is steering. Often it is just a passenger narrating the journey. Think about what you did this morning. You probably woke up and moved through a sequence: phone check, bathroom, coffee, breakfast, getting dressed, in a way that felt like conscious living but required almost no actual conscious decision-making. The sequence just happened. You were not at each step weighing your options and selecting the optimal path. You were running a program built not by willpower but by repetition, context, and time. And here is the crucial insight. That program runs whether you are paying attention to it or not. It runs when you are stressed. It runs when you are tired. It runs when your willpower, your finite, exhaustible, depleting conscious resource, has been used up by the demands of the day. And this is exactly where the willpower model collapses. Because willpower, unlike the automatic self, is not a constant. It is a resource that fluctuates. It is highest in the morning and lowest at night. It diminishes with every decision you make, every temptation you resist, every frustration you manage. The more demands you place on it, the more it drains. And in the modern world, with its relentless flood of decisions, its constant digital stimulation, its social and professional pressures, most people are operating on depleted willpower for the majority of their waking hours. This is not a character flaw, it is physiology. The part of the brain responsible for deliberate, willpower-driven decision-making is metabolically expensive. It consumes resources, and when those resources run low, the brain does not wait for you to consciously decide to conserve them. It simply starts routing more and more behavior through the automatic system. Through habit. Through whatever patterns have been laid down in the past, regardless of whether those patterns serve you now. So, here is what is actually happening when your cousin posts on social media that she is going to change her life, rallies her friends, starts strong, and then quietly returns to where she was. It is not a failure of desire. Her desire was real. It is not a failure of commitment. Her commitment was genuine. What happened is that she tried to use willpower, a finite, depleting, context-sensitive resource, as the primary engine for overriding deeply established automatic behavior patterns. And willpower, used that way, will always eventually lose. Not because she is weak, not because anyone is weak, but because that is simply not what willpower is built for. It was never designed to carry that load. If you have ever watched a person of extraordinary accomplishment and wondered what they have that you do not, the athlete who trains at dawn every day without fail, the writer who produces pages every morning before the rest of the world wakes up, the professional who shows up reliably, consistently at the same high level year after year, you may have assumed that what you are witnessing is an act of sustained willpower, that these people simply want it more than others, that they have somehow found a reservoir of discipline that other people lack. But if you could see inside their daily experience, what you would find is almost the opposite. The most consistent high performers are not, in general, people who are constantly fighting against themselves. They are people who have, over time and through deliberate repetition, made their most important behaviors automatic. The athlete does not will herself to the gym every morning. She goes the way you brush your teeth. not because she makes a fresh decision each day, but because the context cues are in place, the repetition is deeply ingrained, and the behavior runs largely on its own. Willpower is what got the habit started, but something else entirely is what sustains it, and that something else, that invisible architecture of automatic behavior that makes lasting change possible, is what so many of us have never been taught to see, let alone to build deliberately. Self-control research has turned up a finding that initially seems counterintuitive. The people who score highest on self-control in psychological testing are not, on closer examination, the people who most frequently resist temptation. They are the people who most rarely encounter temptation to begin with, not because temptation does not exist in their world, but because they have arranged their world, their contexts, their environments, their daily structures, in such a way that the temptation rarely arises. They are not more disciplined in the moment-to-moment sense. They have designed a life in which the moment-to-moment battle is mostly avoided. This distinction is everything. The person who depends on willpower to avoid the biscuits must fight the battle every single time the tin is in front of them, and each fight costs something. The person who simply does not keep biscuits in the house does not fight that battle at all. The effort has been moved upstream, from the moment of temptation to the moment of environmental design, and upstream decisions made once can eliminate hundreds of downstream battles that would each require willpower to win. This is not a loophole or a cheat. It is, in fact, the actual mechanism by which durable change works. Now consider how differently you might approach your own attempts at change if you genuinely internalized this, not as an abstract idea, but as a lived reality. If you stopped asking, how do I get myself to do this every day, and started asking, how do I build a life in which this happens without requiring a daily fight? The entire project of self-improvement shifts. It becomes less about moral fortitude and more about architecture, less about suffering through your own resistance, and more about quietly, patiently redesigning the conditions under which your behavior unfolds. This is not to say that effort does not matter. It is not to say that decision and intention are meaningless. The conscious self, the deliberate, reflecting, choosing part of you, plays a critical role. But it is not the role most people assign to it. Its greatest power is not in the daily battle against habit. Its greatest power is in the upstream work of designing the conditions that make the right behavior easy and the wrong behavior harder. Intention is the architect. Habit is the builder, and for most of us, we have been so focused on trying to hire a better builder that we have completely forgotten to design a better building. The people who fail most painfully at change are often the most motivated. Motivation is not what is missing. What is missing is the understanding that motivation alone, desire, intention, self-command, operates through a different system than the one that actually runs most of our daily behavior. When those two systems are not aligned, the automatic system wins every time. Not because the person is weak, because that is how the system works. Fighting it with more willpower is like trying to win an arm wrestling match against yourself. Exhausting, futile, and likely to leave you feeling worse than when you started. What you need is not more willpower. What you need is a working understanding of the hidden machinery of human behavior, the system that runs silently beneath your conscious life, building and maintaining patterns that will outlast any resolution you make, any discipline you summon, any promise you keep. That system is not your enemy. In fact, it is one of the most extraordinary tools you will ever have access to. But like any tool, it must be understood before it can be used. And understanding it begins with letting go of the story you have been told about who you are and why you fail. A story built on the myth of willpower that has been holding you back far longer than any bad habit ever has. The change you want is possible. It is not waiting on the other side of greater willpower or stronger discipline or a better version of yourself. It is waiting on the other side of a different question. Not, why can't I make myself do this? But, what would make this happen on its own? That question is where everything begins. And answering it is exactly what we are here to do. Chapter 2. The Hidden Machinery of Behavior. There is a version of yourself that you almost never meet. Not because it is hidden in any dramatic or mysterious sense, but because it operates so smoothly, so efficiently, so far below the surface of your conscious awareness that you simply never notice it working. It runs in the background of every ordinary day, managing the vast majority of what you do, quietly steering your hands and feet and choices through the familiar terrain of your life. You walk past it on the way to work. You use it every time you drive a route you know well. It is there when you reach for your coffee cup before you are fully awake, when you navigate your kitchen in the dark, when you respond to a familiar social situation before you have consciously decided how to respond. It is, in every meaningful sense, a second self, and it is far more powerful, far more present, and far more consequential than most people ever realize. To understand this second self, you first have to be honest about something that is surprisingly difficult to accept. The thinking mind, that voice inside your head that believes it is running the show, is not actually running the show. Not most of the time. The inner narrator, the deliberate decider, the conscious you that reflects and plans and sets intentions. This is only one part of how a human being moves through the world, and it is, in practical terms, a smaller part than you think. For a long time, the dominant assumption in both popular culture and mainstream science was that human behavior flows primarily from conscious thought. You believe something, you decide to act on that belief, and action follows. You want to be healthy, so you choose healthy foods. You want to be productive, so you plan your day. In this model, the mind is a kind of sovereign, issuing commands that the body faithfully carries out. Change the mind, and the behavior changes with it. This was the foundational premise of enormous amounts of research, policy, and self-help advice. Inform people, persuade them, get them to believe the right things, and the right behavior will follow. The problem is that this model turned out to be deeply, demonstrably wrong. The evidence against it has accumulated slowly from many different directions over many decades. It came from behavioral economists who discovered that people make systematically irrational decisions in predictable ways, not randomly, not because they lacked information, but because something other than deliberate reasoning was driving their choices. It came from neuroscientists who began mapping the brain's decision-making architecture and found that many actions are initiated and largely completed before the conscious mind is even aware they are happening. It came from social psychologists who ran experiment after experiment showing that people's behavior could be dramatically altered by tiny, subtle changes in their environment. Changes that the participants themselves never noticed and that operated entirely outside their conscious awareness. And it came from a deceptively simple research method, just asking people, in the middle of their everyday lives, what they were doing and why. The technique, known as experience sampling, works like this. People carry a device with them, originally a pager, later a smartphone, and at random intervals throughout the day, it prompts them to stop and answer a few quick questions. What are you doing right now? Are you thinking about what you are doing, or is your mind somewhere else? Do you feel like you are making a conscious choice in this moment, or are you operating on something more like autopilot? The results were both fascinating and humbling. Across thousands of participants and hundreds of thousands of recorded moments, a consistent picture emerged. Somewhere close to half of everything people do in their daily lives, eating, commuting, exercising, working, socializing, is done in a state of reduced conscious awareness. Not in a trance, not robotically, but in a mode where the behavior is running on a kind of internal automatic system, triggered by familiar cues in the environment and guided by patterns laid down through previous repetition. The behavior happens, and the conscious mind watches it happen, or simply does not notice it happening at all. This finding, once you truly absorb it, changes everything. It means that the model of the sovereign conscious mind, the one in which you choose and decide your way through the day, is a comfortable fiction. A useful one, perhaps, in the sense that it allows us to maintain a coherent narrative of our own agency, but a fiction nonetheless. The actual situation is more like this. You have two distinct behavioral systems operating simultaneously. The first is deliberate, conscious, effortful, flexible. It is the system you use when you encounter something new, when you are learning, when you are solving a problem, when you are in an unfamiliar situation that requires active thinking. This system is powerful and capable, but it is slow, and it is expensive, in the sense that it requires attention and mental energy that are both finite and exhausting to sustain. The second system is automatic, fast, efficient, and largely invisible. It is the system that handles familiar behaviors in familiar contexts, drawing on patterns established through past repetition to execute actions without requiring conscious direction. This system does not get tired. It does not deplete. It just runs. What we call a habit is not a single thing. It is a relationship between three elements: a context, a behavior, and the repetition that has linked them together over time. When a particular context, a place, a time, a social situation, an emotional state, a sequence of events, has been consistently associated with a particular behavior in the past, the automatic system begins to treat that context as a trigger. The behavior becomes the response. And over time, with enough repetition, the link between context and behavior becomes so strong that the conscious mind is largely bypassed. The behavior simply activates when the trigger appears, the way a reflex activates when a nerve is struck. Not because you decided to do it, not because you consciously wanted to in that moment, but because the machinery runs. To see this clearly, it helps to think about learning to drive. When you first sat behind the wheel, driving required your full conscious attention. Every action, checking mirrors, adjusting pressure on the accelerator, estimating distance, preparing to brake, processing the movement of other cars, had to be deliberately thought about. You could not hold a conversation. You could barely listen to the radio. The cognitive load of driving was so high that it occupied essentially your entire available mental capacity. Now, after years of repetition on familiar routes, driving has become almost entirely automatic. You arrive at your destination and realize you cannot fully account for the last 15 minutes. Your hands moved the steering wheel, your foot managed the pedals, you navigated traffic and stopped at lights, and almost none of it required deliberate conscious thought. The driving did not disappear from your behavior. It moved from the effortful conscious system into the automatic system. It became a habit. This transition from effortful to automatic is one of the most remarkable things the human brain does. And it does it constantly, with any behavior that is repeated enough times in a consistent enough context. The brain is, at a fundamental level, an efficiency machine. It is always looking for ways to handle familiar situations with less effort, to offload routine processing to faster, cheaper systems, to free up the costly conscious mind for genuine novelty. Every time you repeat a behavior in a recognizable context, the brain is quietly working to make that behavior more automatic, easier to trigger, faster to execute, less dependent on conscious direction. Think about what this means for your daily life. Every routine you have, every morning ritual, every commuting pattern, every eating habit, every way you respond to stress or boredom or loneliness, was once a conscious choice that became, through repetition, an automatic response. You did not decide to keep doing it. You did not renew your commitment to it each day. At some point, the behavior simply moved into the automatic system, and now it runs without you. This is true of the habits you love. It is equally true of the habits you hate. The automatic system does not distinguish between good and bad, helpful and harmful. It simply preserves whatever has been repeated. It is a faithful recorder, not a judge. Now here is where the insight deepens and where it becomes genuinely useful. Because if habit is a relationship between context and behavior established through repetition, then habit is also, at its core, a property of the context as much as it is a property of the person. Your habits do not live entirely inside you. They live in a very real sense in the relationship between you and your environment. The same person can have completely different behavioral tendencies in different contexts. Not because they have changed, but because the triggers are different. Take someone who eats carefully and thoughtfully at home, who has established a clean, organized kitchen and a stable meal routine over years of repetition, and put them in an airport at 7 in the morning after a delayed flight, surrounded by fast food and bright lights and the low-grade stress of travel. The same person is likely to eat very differently. Not because their values changed, not because their willpower evaporated, but because the context changed, and with it, the automatic patterns that context triggers. This context dependence of habit is one of the most consistently misunderstood aspects of human behavior. We tend to attribute behavior to the person, to their character, their discipline, their intelligence, their values. And while those things are real and matter, they operate within a context that shapes them enormously. The reason it feels so natural to attribute behavior to character alone is that we almost always observe people in consistent contexts. The person who is always punctual is also, usually, always living in a life where punctuality has been deeply ingrained by consistent environmental cues. The person who always eats well has usually arranged an environment that supports that eating. What looks like character is often, at least partly, architecture. This is not a diminishment of human agency, it is actually an expansion of it. Because if behavior is shaped by context, then deliberately designing your context is one of the most powerful things you can do. And unlike willpower, which you cannot create more of, which depletes under pressure, which fails precisely when you need it most, context is something you can engineer. You can build it, arrange it, optimize it. You can make it work for you rather than against you. The automatic system, that second self running in the background, is not something you fight against or override. It is something you set up. But before you can set it up deliberately, you have to be willing to see it honestly. And seeing it honestly requires confronting something uncomfortable, the introspective illusion. The introspective illusion is the deeply human tendency to believe that we understand our own behavior, that when we do something, we know why we did it, what prompted it, what feeling or thought preceded it. This feels absolutely certain from the inside. You eat the cookie and you know it was because you were stressed. You snapped at your colleague and you know it was because of the difficult morning you had. You skipped the workout and you know it was because you were tired. The story of cause and effect seems clear and available, as if you could simply look inward and see the actual mechanism of your own behavior. But research tells a very different story. In study after study, when people's actual behavioral triggers are examined experimentally, when researchers systematically vary the conditions people are in and watch how behavior changes, the explanations people give for their own behavior turn out to be remarkably unreliable. People report being motivated by one thing when they are actually responding to something else entirely. They report making conscious choices when the choice was effectively made by context before their conscious mind was involved. They construct narratives about their behavior that are coherent and confident and often substantially inaccurate. This is not dishonesty. It is the natural function of a mind that narrates the self. The conscious mind, denied access to the actual machinery of automatic behavior, does what it always does with gaps in information. It fills them in. It tells a story that makes sense, that is consistent with identity and values and the available evidence, and it presents that story as memory and insight. And the story is convincing because it feels like direct access to the truth. But it is, at least partially, confabulation, a sincere and unconscious construction. What this means practically is that you cannot trust introspection alone to understand your habits. If you want to know why you always reach for your phone at a certain time, or why you always overeat in a certain social situation, or why you consistently abandon new behaviors after a few weeks, simply asking yourself why and trusting your answer is not reliable enough. The real answer is probably in the context, not the character. It is probably in the triggers you have not consciously noticed, the environmental cues you have stopped seeing because they are so familiar, the patterns of repetition that have been quietly shaping your behavior for years without your awareness. This requires a shift in how you observe yourself, not introspection, but observation, not asking, what do I think about this behavior, but watching, as if from a slight distance, the conditions under which the behavior arises. Noticing the time of day, the place, the people, the emotional state, the preceding events. Treating yourself gently and without judgment as someone you are genuinely curious about, someone whose patterns you want to understand so that you can work with them rather than against them. There is a strange liberation in this shift. When you stop explaining your behavior in terms of character, in terms of what it says about who you are, and start explaining it in terms of context and pattern, the shame dissolves. The behavior that you interpreted as a personal failing becomes instead a predictable response to a set of conditions. It is not that you are weak, it is that the conditions you are in consistently trigger this response. And conditions, unlike character, can be changed. Think of someone who has tried and failed, perhaps many times, to establish a regular exercise habit. The usual interpretation is that they lack commitment or discipline or genuine motivation. But consider what the research would say. In all likelihood, they have been trying to make the exercise happen through conscious effort and renewed intention in an environment that has not been designed to support it. The gym bag is not packed the night before. The workout clothes are not laid out. The alarm is set at a time that makes the first decision of the morning a battle between sleep and effort. The route to the gym requires a detour that, on a stressed or tired morning, is easily skipped. Every single one of these is a context variable. Every single one contributes to the triggering of the automatic system, or the failure to trigger it. The person is not the problem. The architecture is the problem. Now imagine the same person rearranges the conditions. The gym bag is packed and sitting by the door. The workout clothes are the first thing they see. They have joined a class with a friend, so skipping involves a social cost as well as a personal one. The gym is on the way to work, not out of the way. These changes require effort exactly once, in the moment of design. After that, the environment does its work silently, nudging behavior in the right direction day after day without requiring fresh willpower each time. This is what it means to understand the hidden machinery of behavior, not to override it, not to fight it, but to recognize it for what it is. An extraordinarily powerful, largely invisible system that is already shaping everything you do, and then to work with it deliberately, to become, in a very real sense, the designer of your own automatic self, not through the slow, painful work of changing who you are, but through the much more tractable work of changing the world you move through, your second self. The automatic, habitual, context-driven self is not a lesser version of you. It is not the enemy of your growth or the obstacle to your potential. It is the system through which everything you have ever learned and everything you have ever practiced has been consolidated into effortless competence. Every skill you have ever mastered lives there. Every reliable behavior you count on to carry you through the day lives there. It is the part of you that keeps working when the thinking mind is tired, distracted, overwhelmed, or simply occupied with something else. The question is not whether to have a second self. You already have one. The question is whether it is working for you or against you. Whether the automatic patterns running in the background of your life are the ones you would choose if you were choosing deliberately. And if they are not, if the machinery is running old programs that no longer serve you, then the path forward is not to fight harder. It is to understand the machinery well enough to rewire it. That rewiring, patient, deliberate, and far more effective than any resolution ever made in the heat of motivation, is exactly what the rest of this journey is about. Chapter 3. Why Knowledge is Never Enough. There is a gap at the center of human life that almost no one talks about honestly. It is not the gap between what we have and what we want, or between where we are and where we hoped to be. It is a more fundamental gap than either of those. The gap between what we know and what we do. It is the gap that exists in the person who knows every nutritional fact about every food they eat and still cannot maintain a healthy diet. It is the gap that lives in the doctor who counsels patients about the dangers of smoking while stepping outside to light a cigarette between appointments. It is the gap that haunts the financial advisor who gives sound money management advice all day and goes home to a bank account that contradicts everything they have told their clients. It is the gap that makes intelligent, informed, deeply aware people feel like failures, not because they lack information, but because information, it turns out, was never really the engine of behavior to begin with. We have been told, implicitly and explicitly for most of our lives, that knowledge is the solution. That if people only understood the consequences of their choices, if they knew the health risks, the financial costs, the relational damage, the long-term impact, they would choose differently. This belief is so deeply embedded in how we design education, public health campaigns, policy, and self-help culture that it almost never gets questioned. We fund awareness campaigns, we put warning labels on things, we create information programs, we assume that the path from knowing to doing is short and reliable, that once a person truly understands something, the behavior change will follow almost automatically. But the evidence, accumulated steadily and across many different domains, tells a different story. A story that is initially disorienting and ultimately liberating if you are willing to sit with it long enough to understand what it actually means. Consider what happened when large-scale public health campaigns began informing people about the benefits of eating more fruits and vegetables. The campaigns were well-designed, well-funded, and well-intentioned. They used simple, memorable messages. They ran across television, radio, print, and eventually digital media. They reached millions of people, and the results were tracked carefully. At the end of those campaigns, surveys showed that a significant portion of the population had indeed acquired the intended knowledge. They knew the recommended daily servings of fruits and vegetables. They understood the connection between diet and health outcomes. They could articulate, when asked, why eating well mattered. And then researchers looked at the actual eating behavior of those same people. The gap was startling. Knowing the recommendation made almost no measurable difference to actual consumption. People who could accurately state the guidelines ate essentially the same amount of fruit and vegetables as people who could not. The knowledge had arrived and been filed away somewhere, and daily behavior had continued on its established course, largely undisturbed. The information had entered the mind. It had simply failed to reach the hands and mouth. This pattern appears across domain after domain with a consistency that should, by now, have fundamentally changed how we approach behavior change. People who have been thoroughly educated about the long-term health consequences of physical inactivity are no more likely to exercise than people who have not. Knowledge of the compound effects of debt does not reliably change spending behavior. Understanding the psychological mechanisms of procrastination does not reliably cure it. Being aware that you are being manipulated by advertising does not make you reliably immune to it. Knowing that social media is engineered to exploit your attention does not, for most people, result in meaningfully reduced use. At some point, the only honest conclusion is that knowledge, while valuable, while necessary in many contexts, while genuinely important, is simply not the mechanism by which behavior changes. It is not the lever, it is not the engine. It is something else. A passenger, sometimes, in a vehicle being driven by forces that are older, deeper, and far less verbal than conscious understanding. To feel the full weight of this, you have to understand something about the architecture of the mind. The automatic system, the one that runs habits, that responds to contextual triggers, that executes familiar behaviors without conscious direction, did not evolve to respond to information. It evolved to respond to experience, specifically to the repeated experience of doing something in a particular context and receiving some outcome. The automatic system learns through action and consequence, through repetition and reinforcement, through the slow accumulation of associations between cues and behaviors that are built up over time in the actual lived world. It does not learn through lectures. It does not update itself when you read a compelling article. It is not moved by statistics, however frightening, or by arguments, however logical. The conscious mind, by contrast, is exquisitely suited to handling information. It can process language, evaluate evidence, update beliefs, form new intentions, reason about consequences, and plan future behavior. It is the part of you that can sit down with this book and genuinely understand everything in it. And that understanding is real. It is not trivial. But the conscious mind's jurisdiction stops somewhere short of the automatic system. You can know something deeply and sincerely, and still have that knowledge fail to penetrate the layer at which your daily behavior is actually being generated. Think about this in terms of your own experience. You have almost certainly had the experience of understanding something intellectually, truly understanding it, not just superficially acknowledging it, and finding that the understanding made no practical difference to your behavior. Perhaps you understood that the anger you were expressing was disproportionate to the situation, and you expressed it anyway. Perhaps you understood that the second glass of wine was a bad idea, and you poured it anyway. Perhaps you understood that the person you were arguing with was not actually your enemy, and you argued as if they were. In each case, the conscious mind provided accurate information to a process that was already well underway and largely unaffected by that information. This is not weakness. This is not irrationality in the pejorative sense. This is the normal operating condition of a human being. The automatic system and the conscious system are not in perfect communication. They use different languages, respond to different inputs, and operate on different timescales. And when they conflict, when what you consciously know points in one direction and what your automatic patterns are pulling you toward points in another, the automatic system wins far more often than the conscious system does. Not always, not inevitably, but far more often than the story of the sovereign rational mind would have us believe. Now consider the implications of this for how you have been approaching change. If you have ever decided that the way to change a behavior was to learn more about why you should change it, to read more about the consequences, to understand the psychology more deeply, to watch documentaries and listen to podcasts and gather evidence until the case for change was absolutely airtight, you have been investing in the wrong currency. Not because that knowledge is worthless, but because you have been trying to use conscious understanding to alter a system that does not primarily respond to conscious understanding. You have been writing letters in English to a part of the brain that only reads experience. This is, in fact, the source of one of the most demoralizing cycles in the human experience of self-improvement, the cycle of understanding without change. A person realizes they need to change something, they research it, they learn about it, they understand it better and better, perhaps better than almost anyone around them, and still the behavior does not change. And so they conclude that the problem is they do not understand it deeply enough yet, so they research more, learn more, read more. The understanding deepens, the behavior remains the same, and after enough cycles of this, the person begins to feel a particular kind of despair. The despair of someone who has done everything right and still gotten nowhere. The painful truth is that they have not, in fact, done everything right. They have done everything right within a model that was wrong from the beginning. They have been optimizing the conscious mind's understanding of a problem that the automatic system is generating. It is like trying to fix a mechanical failure by writing a more accurate description of the machine. The description might be perfect. The machine does not care. What changes the automatic system is not knowing. It is doing. Specifically, doing repeatedly, in a consistent context, with some form of outcome that the automatic system can register. Experience, not understanding. Repetition, not resolution. Action in the world, not insight about the world. The automatic system learns the way a child learns to walk, not by understanding the biomechanics of bipedal locomotion, but by falling and recovering again and again, until the body has built the pattern from the inside out. This means that the beginning of real change is not the moment of understanding. It is the first, imperfect, often uncomfortable act of doing the new thing in the actual conditions of your actual life. Not thinking about it, not planning to do it, not reading one more chapter about how to do it. Doing it. Badly at first, probably. Awkwardly, with full conscious attention and significant effort, doing it in a way that feels nothing like the smooth automatic behavior you hope it will eventually become. But doing it because the automatic system cannot be built from the outside by an observer. It can only be built from the inside by a doer. There is a particular kind of person who accumulates enormous amounts of knowledge about self-improvement without ever substantially improving. You may know someone like this, or you may recognize this pattern in yourself. They can discuss motivation theory, habit loops, cognitive biases, behavioral economics, and the neuroscience of change with fluency and precision. They have read all the books, followed all the researchers, understood all the mechanisms, and yet their daily life continues to look remarkably similar to how it looked before they began their education. The knowledge has not moved. It has simply piled up in the conscious mind, impressive and inert, while the automatic system continues to run the same programs it has always run. This is not stupidity. It is a misunderstanding of where change lives. Change does not live in the mind. It lives in the body, in behavior, in the repeated experience of doing something different in the real world. The mind can point toward change. It can design the conditions for change. It can sustain the intention through the early difficult period when the new behavior is still effortful and uncomfortable, and the old behavior is calling. But it cannot, by itself, create the new automatic pattern. Only experience can do that. Consider someone learning a new language. In the early stages, they study vocabulary lists, memorize grammar rules, read explanations of conjugation and syntax, understand the structure of the language intellectually. This knowledge is useful. It is the scaffold. But no one has ever become fluent in a language by studying it. Fluency comes from speaking, from stumbling through actual conversations with actual people, from making errors and being corrected, from hearing the language in context again and again until the patterns start to feel natural rather than constructed. The knowledge creates the map, the speaking walks the territory, and only walking the territory builds fluency. The same logic applies to every behavioral change you have ever tried to make. The reading and understanding is the map. The actual doing, imperfect, awkward, effortful, is the walking. You need the map to know where you are going, but you cannot get there by studying the map more carefully. At some point, you have to fold it up and start walking. What makes this especially challenging is that the beginning of the walking is never graceful. When you start a new behavior without the support of habit, it feels wrong in a way that is hard to describe. Effortful in a way that the old automatic behavior never felt. Self-conscious in a way that makes you wonder if you are doing it right. Fragile in a way that makes you sure you will not be able to sustain it. Everything about the early stage of a new behavior sends signals to the conscious mind that this is not natural, not easy, not who you really are. And the old behavior, by contrast, sends every possible signal that it is effortless, familiar, comfortable, and easy. In the early stages, the contrast between the difficulty of the new and the ease of the old makes it almost impossible not to interpret the new behavior as inferior, as something you are forcing rather than something that fits. This is the phase where most people quit. Not because the new behavior is actually bad for them, not because they do not want the eventual result, but because the experience of the early stage is so uncomfortable that the mind generates a new understanding, a new piece of knowledge, that the effort is not worth it, that this particular approach is not working, that they should try a different strategy, do more research, find a better method. And so the cycle of understanding without change begins again. What you need to survive the early stage is not more motivation and not more knowledge. What you need is a realistic picture of what this stage actually is. It is not evidence that the behavior is wrong for you. It is not evidence that you lack the capacity. It is the unavoidable early phase of every new habit before it has been repeated enough times for the automatic system to take it over. It is supposed to feel effortful. The effort is not the problem. It is the process. And the only way through it is through it, not around, not over, not by pausing to understand it more deeply. Through it, into the other side where repetition has done its work and the behavior begins to feel, slowly and then suddenly, like something that belongs to you. The liberation in understanding all of this is real and profound. If behavior change is not primarily about knowing, then it is not primarily about intelligence. It is not primarily about education or insight or having the right information or being smart enough to understand the stakes. It is about doing, which means it is available to every person regardless of their level of formal education, their intellectual capacity, or how much they have or have not read about the topic. The person with less understanding who actually does the new behavior will change faster and more durably than the person with perfect understanding who continues to study rather than act. The smartest thing you can do in many cases is the deliberate choice to be less smart, to stop trying to think your way to a new life and start building it one repeated action at a time. This does not mean that understanding is useless. Far from it. Understanding the mechanics of habit formation is what allows you to set up the conditions that make the repeated action more likely to occur, more likely to stick, and more likely to build into genuine automaticity over time. Understanding the role of context means you can design a context that works for you. Understanding the role of reward means you can build in the early reinforcement that helps the automatic system learn. Understanding the importance of repetition means you will not give up too early, will not interpret the difficulty of the early stage as permanent, will not mistake the effort of the beginning for the nature of the thing. Knowledge, in other words, is the designer of the experiment. But the experiment still has to be run, and it has to be run in the world, with your actual body, in your actual daily life, through actual repeated action. No amount of understanding can substitute for that. No amount of reading can replace doing. No insight, however profound, can build the automatic pattern that only experience can build. The most important thing you can know about behavior change is that knowing is not enough, not nearly enough. But knowing that knowing is not enough, really absorbing that, letting it change the way you approach your own growth, is in fact one of the most useful things you can know, because it will stop you from waiting until you understand enough to begin. It will stop you from treating the next book, the next framework, the next podcast as a necessary prerequisite for action. It will put the emphasis exactly where the science says it belongs, not on the quality of your intentions, not on the depth of your understanding, not on the strength of your motivation, but on the first, imperfect, unglamorous, absolutely essential act of doing the thing. Go do the thing. Not after you have understood it better, not after you have designed the perfect system, not after you feel ready, because the feeling of readiness is largely generated by the old automatic system and it may never fully arrive. Do it now, in the conditions you are actually in, with the imperfect resources you actually have. Do it again tomorrow. Do it in the same context, at the same time, in a way that you can repeat. Do it with enough frequency that the automatic system begins to notice the pattern. Do it past the point where it feels effortful, and into the territory where it begins to feel familiar. And then do it past familiar, into the place where it begins to feel like you. That is where the knowledge finally lands, not in the mind, where you put it when you read it, but in the body, in the behavior, in the lived experience of someone who has done the thing enough times that it has become part of the automatic machinery of their life. That is where knowing and doing finally meet, not on the page and not in the plan, but in the repetition that writes the new pattern into the deepest, most durable layer of who you are. Chapter 4. The Power of Context. There is an experiment that never gets old, no matter how many times you hear it described, because every time you do, something shifts slightly in how you see yourself and the world around you. Researchers take two groups of people and give them both a simple task, something like choosing between a healthy snack and an unhealthy one, or deciding whether to donate to a cause or determining how hard they will work on a problem. The groups are identical in every meaningful way, same age range, same general background, same level of motivation coming in. But there is one small difference. One group is in a clean, orderly, well-lit room. The other group is in a slightly cluttered, dimly lit, mildly chaotic space. That is it. That is the only variable. The behavioral differences between the two groups are significant and consistent. The people in the ordered environment make more disciplined food choices. They donate more. They persist longer at difficult tasks. Not because they are better people, not because they are more motivated or more intelligent or more virtuous, simply because the room they are sitting in is different. The environment sent signals, subtle, mostly unconscious signals, and the automatic behavioral system responded to those signals before the conscious mind had any say in the matter. If you find this unsettling, you are paying attention. The implication is not comfortable. The physical world around you is not a neutral backdrop to your choices. It is an active participant in them. It is, in a very real sense, co-authoring your behavior at every moment of every day, shaping what you reach for, what you avoid, how long you persist, how impulsively or carefully you act, through a constant stream of cues that operate almost entirely outside your awareness. You think you are making choices. You are. But you are making them inside an environment that is powerfully and silently pre-selecting which choices are most likely. Context is the word behavioral science uses for everything in your surroundings that influences your behavior. It includes the obvious physical elements, the places you spend time, the objects within reach, the layout of your home and workspace, the route you walk, the stores you pass. But it includes much more than the physical. Context also means the people you are around, the social norms operating in a given situation, the time of day, and how your energy levels have been shaped by what came before, the emotional state you are in when you arrive somewhere, the sequence of events that preceded the current moment. All of it, the visible and invisible, the physical and social, the spatial and temporal, constitutes the context in which every behavior either arises or does not. And the research is unambiguous. Context is far more powerful a predictor of behavior than intention, knowledge, motivation, or character. This is one of the most consistently replicated findings in all of behavioral science, and also one of the most consistently ignored findings in popular culture. We love stories about individuals overcoming their circumstances through sheer force of will. We are deeply attached to the idea that the strong, determined, virtuous person rises above their environment, that the environment is just the setting and the person is the real actor. But the data, accumulated across thousands of studies and millions of behavioral observations, simply does not support this story. The environment is not just the setting, it is one of the most powerful actors in the play. Consider something as intimate and seemingly personal as what you eat for breakfast. For most people, breakfast is among the most habitual meals of the day, the most consistent, the least varied, the most automatic. And when you examine why this is, context is almost the entire explanation. Breakfast happens in the same place every day, the same kitchen, the same seat, the same sequence of cues. The coffee maker goes on, the cupboard is opened, the familiar box is reached for. The behavior is not a fresh decision each morning. It is the automatic system responding to a stable set of environmental triggers it has encountered hundreds of times before. Change the kitchen, move to a new home, stay in a hotel, visit a friend. And breakfast immediately becomes more conscious, more deliberate, more varied. The person has not changed. The context has. Now scale this up from breakfast to an entire day, an entire week, an entire life. Most of what you do most of the time happens in contexts you have been in before, responding to triggers you have encountered many times, following patterns that were established through past repetition. You are not, for most of your day, making fresh decisions in a neutral environment. You are navigating a world that you have, in many ways, experienced before, and your automatic system is drawing on all of that prior experience to generate behavior without requiring fresh conscious deliberation. The context is not just influencing your behavior. In a profound and practical sense, it is running it. This should be, and once you absorb it actually is, deeply empowering. Because if context shapes behavior this powerfully, then deliberately redesigning your context is one of the highest leverage things you can do. Not the most dramatic thing, not the most emotionally satisfying thing. But in terms of actual behavioral output, in terms of what you will actually do day after day automatically without requiring willpower or renewed motivation, it may be the single most effective investment of your effort. The clearest way to understand context design is through what professional chefs call mise en place, a French phrase that means quite literally everything in its place. In a professional kitchen, before any cooking begins, a chef arranges the workspace completely. Every ingredient is prepped and portioned. Every tool is cleaned, sharpened, and positioned exactly where it will be needed. Every element of the recipe is laid out in the order of use. Nothing is left to be decided in the moment of cooking, because in the moment of cooking, when the heat is high and timing is critical and attention is fully occupied, a decision about where the salt is or whether the cutting board is available is not a small inconvenience. It is a disruption that can cascade into a series of errors that compromises the whole dish. The chef understands something that most people never apply to their own lives. Friction matters enormously. Friction. The small obstacles, the minor inconveniences, the extra steps between intention and action is not trivial. Every increment of friction added to a desired behavior makes it less likely to occur. Every increment of friction removed makes it more likely. And because the behaviors we are trying to build are often ones that the automatic system has not yet taken over, meaning they still require some degree of conscious effort, they are especially vulnerable to friction. A small obstacle in the path of an established habit barely registers. A small obstacle in the path of a fragile new behavior can be the thing that stops it entirely. Think about the person trying to start a daily meditation practice. They intend to meditate for 10 minutes each morning. They have the app downloaded. They know how to do it. They genuinely want the outcome, but the cushion is in the closet. The phone, which has the app, is in another room. The specific spot they have imagined meditating is usually occupied in the morning by a bag or a pile of clothes they have not put away. Every one of these is a small friction. None of them individually seems significant. But the cumulative effect of encountering 3 small obstacles before a behavior that is still new and effortful and not yet automatic is often enough to produce a hesitation, and the hesitation is often enough to produce a diversion. Just this once, just because the morning is busy, just because the conditions are not quite right today, and just this once repeated enough times is how a habit dies before it was ever really born. Now reverse it. The cushion is already in the spot. The phone is on the cushion from the night before. The space is kept clear because the person has made it their one non-negotiable environmental design choice. The first cue they encounter in the morning, even before coffee, even before full wakefulness, is the visual trigger of the prepared space. The behavior is not made inevitable, but the friction has been reduced to nearly nothing, and the cue is powerful and consistent, and over time the automatic system begins to respond to that cue before the conscious mind has even had a chance to weigh the morning's options. The habit forms not because the person tried harder, but because the environment did more of the work. This is the design principle at the heart of effective context change. Make the right behavior easy and the wrong behavior hard. Not through willpower, not through motivation, not through renewed commitment, but through the physical arrangement of your world. Move the fruit bowl to the counter and the biscuits to the high shelf. Keep the running shoes next to the front door. Put the book on the pillow. Charge your phone in another room. Lay out tomorrow's workout clothes tonight. Each of these is a micro-design decision that shifts the cost-benefit calculation of a behavior before you are even in the moment of choosing. Each one removes a small piece of friction from the path of the desired behavior or adds a small piece of friction to the path of the undesired one. Individually, each feels almost absurdly small. Cumulatively, they restructure the behavioral landscape of your day in ways that significantly and durably change what you actually do. But context is not only physical, social context. The people around you and the norms they embody may be even more powerful than the physical environment as a shaper of behavior. Human beings are profoundly social creatures, and the automatic system has been shaped by millions of years of evolution in social groups where conforming to the behavior of those around you was often a matter of survival. We are exquisitely attuned to what other people are doing, and we are predisposed, at a level far below conscious choice, to do the same. Not through weakness or lack of individuality, but through the deep automatic processing of social information that runs constantly in the background of every social interaction. This means that the people you spend the most time with are one of the most powerful contextual forces in your life. Not because they are consciously influencing your choices, though that happens too, but because their behavior, their norms, their habits, their standards exist as a constant environmental backdrop against which your automatic system calibrates what is normal, what is expected, what is comfortable, and what feels like an effort requiring justification. When the people around you exercise regularly, eating well and exercising becomes the path of least resistance, the thing that fits the context. When the people around you do not, deviating from their norms requires ongoing effort that eating well and exercising would not require in a different social context. This is not an excuse or a fatalistic claim that you are simply a product of your social environment. It is a recognition that social context is one of the levers available to you, and that being intentional about who you surround yourself with, not in a cold, transactional way, but as a genuine recognition of how powerfully other people shape our automatic behavior, is a form of context design with consequences that ripple through every aspect of your life. The person who wants to run regularly and joins a running group is not just finding accountability through conscious social pressure. They are embedding themselves in a social context where running is the norm, where the conversation is about running, where showing up is what everyone does, and not showing up requires more active justification than showing up does. The context does the work. Now, there is something important to say about the limits of context change, because if the power of context is unlimited, the implications would be frightening. They are not unlimited. The context shapes behavior powerfully, but it does not determine it absolutely. People resist their contexts. People change their behaviors despite unfavorable environments. People with every social and physical context working against them build good habits, and people with every context working in their favor still fail too. What context change does is shift the probability distribution of behavior. It makes certain behaviors more or less likely, easier or harder, more or less automatic. It does not guarantee outcomes. It tilts the playing field. And tilting the playing field, consistently, deliberately, in the direction of the behaviors you want, may be the most reliable path to lasting change available to you. Not because it is heroic or dramatic, in fact, because it is neither. It is quiet. It is architectural. It works even when your motivation is low, even when your willpower is depleted, even when you wake up feeling tired and uninspired and thoroughly uninterested in being your best self. The context is still there, still sending its cues, still making certain behaviors easier than others, whether you are at your best or not. This is the difference between context-based change and willpower-based change. Willpower works only when you are feeling strong. Context works all the time. Willpower requires you to be present and deliberate in every moment of temptation. Context removes many of those moments from the equation entirely. Willpower is a renewable resource that depletes and must be replenished. Context, once designed, simply persists. You spend effort once, in the arrangement, the design, the structural decision, and the environment pays that investment back every day, automatically, without further cost. There is one more dimension of context that is often overlooked. and it is perhaps the most transformative of all: the context of your own past behavior. Every behavior you have ever repeated has left a trace, not just in the automatic system as a pattern, but in the physical world as evidence. The running shoes that have been worn tell a story. The kitchen that is stocked with certain foods tells a story. The desk that is arranged in a particular way tells a story. And that evidence, when you encounter it, becomes a cue. The worn shoes trigger the identity of a person who runs. The well-stocked kitchen triggers the identity of a person who eats well. The organized desk triggers the identity of a person who works with focus and intention. This is the deepest form of context design, the one that goes beyond arranging objects and social networks and addresses the narrative of who you are. When you begin to see yourself, genuinely and consistently, as someone who does the thing, not someone who is trying to do the thing, not someone who is working on doing the thing, but someone for whom the thing is simply part of how they live, the context of your own identity begins to reinforce the behavior at every turn. Every action becomes evidence. Every repetition strengthens the signal, and the person you are becoming starts to feel less like an aspiration and more like a description. You live in a world that is constantly, quietly, powerfully designing your behavior. The only question is whether that design is intentional or accidental, working for you or against you, the result of your deliberate choices or the accumulated drift of a life lived on autopilot. You cannot escape the influence of context. No one can. But you can, once you understand how it works, step back from the behavioral landscape you are currently in and ask, if I were designing this from scratch, knowing what I now know about how powerfully place and habit and social norms shape what I do, would I design it this way? If the answer is no, you already know where to start. Chapter 5. The Engine of Repetition. There is a moment in the learning of any skill, any discipline, any practice, any behavioral pattern that is so subtle it almost always passes unnoticed. It is the moment when doing the thing stops feeling like something you are making yourself do and starts feeling like something you simply do. Not a dramatic transformation, not a sudden arrival, more like the gradual lightening of a weight you have been carrying for so long that you stopped noticing how heavy it was until one day you realize it is no longer there. The practice that once required the full force of your attention now moves through you with something closer to ease. The behavior that once felt like an imposition has become, quietly and without ceremony, part of the texture of your ordinary day. Most people, when this shift happens, attribute it to discipline. They think, I have finally become someone who does this. I have trained my willpower to the point where the resistance has dissolved. But this is not quite what happened. What happened is something far more interesting, far more mechanical, and far more applicable to every other behavior you have ever wanted to build. What happened is repetition, specifically a particular kind of repetition, in a particular kind of context, accumulated past a particular threshold. The threshold at which the automatic system steps in, takes the behavior under its management, and begins running it without requiring the constant expensive input of conscious direction. Repetition is not just a strategy for building habits, it is the only strategy. There is no other mechanism. There is no shortcut, no workaround, no more efficient path. The automatic system learns exactly one way, through the repeated experience of doing something in a consistent context and encountering some kind of outcome. That is the complete recipe. Everything else, the motivation, the intention, the understanding, the planning, is scaffolding. Valuable scaffolding, necessary at the beginning, important for pointing the behavior in the right direction. But scaffolding nonetheless, which means it is not the building. The building is constructed solely through the act of doing again and again until the doing becomes the way things are. To understand why repetition works at the level it does, you need to understand what actually happens in the brain when a behavior is repeated. The brain is, at its most fundamental level, a prediction machine. Its primary job is not to process the present moment, but to anticipate what is coming next based on what has come before. It does this by forming associations, links between stimuli and responses, between contexts and behaviors, between actions and outcomes, and it strengthens those associations every time they are confirmed. The more times a particular sequence of events occurs, this context, this behavior, this outcome, the more deeply encoded the link between them becomes. The neural pathways that carry the signals for that behavior become, through repeated activation, more efficient, more myelinated, more capable of running the sequence quickly and with minimal input from the higher-order thinking centers. This is not metaphor. This is literal neuroscience. The physical structure of the brain changes with repetition. Connections that are used frequently become stronger and faster. Connections that are rarely used become weaker and slower. The brain is always, at the microscopic level, being reshaped by what you do. Every repetition of a behavior is a small vote for that behavior becoming easier the next time. Every skipped repetition is a small vote in the other direction. Over time, the accumulated votes produce an architecture, a neural landscape that makes certain behaviors effortless and others increasingly foreign. You are, quite literally, building yourself through what you repeatedly do, not metaphorically, physically. This should give you a very different relationship to the early, effortful stage of building any new behavior. When you are in the phase where the new behavior still feels hard, where you have to think about it, where it still requires attention and effort and deliberate direction, you are not failing to be someone who has this habit. You are in the process of constructing the neural architecture that will eventually allow the habit to run automatically. The effort is not evidence of inadequacy. It is evidence that the construction is underway. The difficulty is not a sign that the behavior is wrong for you. It is the feeling of a neural pathway being carved where none existed before. And like any path, it gets easier with every passage. What makes this particularly fascinating is the relationship between repetition and consciousness. In the early stages of learning any new behavior, it is intensely conscious. Think about someone learning to play the guitar. The first time they try to form a chord, every aspect of it requires deliberate attention. Where to place each finger, how much pressure to apply, how to curve the hand to avoid muting adjacent strings. The whole effort is slow, ungainly, frustrating. There is a significant gap between what they hear in their head and what their hands are producing. But with repetition, not just practice in general, but specific, consistent repetition of the same movements in the same sequence, something begins to change. The fingers start to know where to go before the mind has consciously directed them. The chord begins to form before the decision to form it has been fully articulated. The behavior is being transferred piece by piece from the effortful conscious system to the efficient automatic one. This transfer, from conscious to automatic, is not a loss of skill. It is a deepening of it. When a behavior becomes automatic, it does not become thoughtless. It becomes integrated. It becomes part of the person's operating system rather than a program they have to manually run each time. The concert pianist does not think about each note. The experienced driver does not think about each gear change. The seasoned cook does not consult the recipe for a dish they have made hundreds of times. In each case, the behavior has been so thoroughly repeated that it has been absorbed into the automatic system, where it can run with greater speed, greater fluency, and far lower cognitive cost than the conscious system could ever achieve. Automaticity is not the enemy of mastery. It is the destination of it. Now consider what happens when people try to build habits without understanding this. They set the intention. They begin. They persist through the first day, the first week, even the first few weeks. And then, at some point in the early stage when the behavior is still effortful and the automatic system has not yet taken over, they encounter a difficult day. The motivation is low. The schedule is disrupted. Something comes up. And the behavior is skipped. And here is where the critical misunderstanding often occurs. They interpret the skip as a failure of commitment rather than as a natural disruption of an incomplete pattern. They conclude that they are not the kind of person who does this thing, or that this particular approach is not working, or that they need to reconsider their strategy, and so the repetition stops, and without repetition, the pattern dissolves, and the whole process has to start from the beginning if it starts at all. What they did not know, what no one told them, is that skipping once is almost never the problem. The research on habit formation is quite clear on this. A single missed repetition, in isolation, does not meaningfully set back the formation of an automatic pattern. What destroys habits is not the first skip. It is the pattern of repeated skipping that follows when the first skip is interpreted as evidence of failure. The person who misses Monday and still shows up on Tuesday is fine. The person who misses Monday and interprets that as proof that the habit is failing, and so doesn't show up on Tuesday either, and then it is Thursday and the week is mostly gone anyway, that person has turned a minor disruption into a complete collapse. Not because of the Monday skip, because of the story told about it. This insight, that missing once is not the problem, missing twice is the beginning of a new habit, is one of the most practically useful things you can internalize about repetition. It changes your relationship to the inevitable interruptions and difficult days that are part of any real human life. Instead of treating every missed repetition as a referendum on your commitment, you treat it as weather, something that happened, neither good nor bad, that requires only one response: showing up the next time. Not a bigger, more committed version of showing up, just the ordinary showing up that the pattern requires. The automatic system is not judging you for missing Monday. It is simply waiting for Tuesday to continue the work. There is another dimension of repetition that rarely gets discussed, which is its relationship to identity. When you repeat a behavior consistently over time, something happens that goes beyond the formation of an automatic pattern. The behavior becomes evidence about who you are. Each repetition is, in a quiet and accumulating way, a vote for a particular self-concept. The person who runs every morning, day after day, for weeks and then months, is not just building a running habit. They are building the identity of a runner, and that identity, once it begins to form, becomes its own source of behavioral momentum. Because behavior that is consistent with who you believe yourself to be requires far less effort than behavior that feels like a performance or an imposition. This is why experienced practitioners of any discipline so often say things like, "I can't imagine not doing this," or "It's just who I am now." They are not being dramatic. They are describing accurately what happens when a behavior has been repeated long enough that it has merged with self-concept. At that point, the behavior is no longer maintained by motivation or willpower or even habit in the narrow sense. It is maintained by identity, by the simple fact that it is part of the picture of who this person is. And identity is among the most stable and self-reinforcing forces in human psychology. We do not just hold identities, we protect them, act consistently with them, and feel genuine discomfort when our behavior contradicts them. You can use this understanding deliberately, rather than waiting for the identity to form passively through accumulated repetition, which it will do eventually. If the repetition continues, you can choose to see yourself as the person you are becoming in the very early stages of the behavior, not as self-deception, but as a deliberate act of forward-looking honesty. When you do the behavior, even imperfectly, you are already in some meaningful sense the person who does it. The difference between you now and the polished future version is not kind. It is degree. And treating yourself as the person you are genuinely becoming, rather than the person you used to be, creates a context of identity that supports the repetitions necessary to complete the transformation. But here is where the conversation about repetition gets complicated, and where most advice about habit formation goes wrong. Repetition alone is not enough. Blind repetition, doing the same thing over and over in wildly varying contexts at irregular times with no consistency in the conditions, builds habits far more slowly and sometimes not at all. What the automatic system needs is not just frequency of repetition, but regularity of context. The same behavior in the same context over and over. The stability of the context is what allows the automatic system to form the tight association between trigger and response that constitutes a true habit. Without that stability, the behavior may become practiced and skilled, but never truly automatic. It will always require some degree of conscious direction to initiate. Think about what this means for how you design your repetitions. It is not simply about doing the thing as often as possible. It is about doing the thing as consistently as possible. At the same time, in the same place, following the same cues, building the same chain of associations between context and behavior that the automatic system needs to take over. The person who meditates every morning after coffee, in the same spot before checking their phone, is building a stronger automatic pattern than the person who meditates just as often, but at different times in different places, depending on how the day unfolds. The behavior happens the same number of times, but the context is consistent in the first case and variable in the second. And for the automatic system, consistency of context is almost as important as consistency of repetition. This is also why disruptions to routine are so behaviorally significant, both as risks and as opportunities, which we will explore in depth later. A long holiday, a move to a new city, a major life change. These disrupt the stable contextual cues that have been running existing automatic patterns. And when those cues are disrupted, existing habits become less automatic, requiring more conscious effort to maintain. This is a risk for habits you have worked to build. But it is also, and this is crucial, an opportunity for habits you have been trying to break. Because the disruption of context that makes good habits fragile also makes bad habits fragile. The window of change that opens when the familiar context is removed is a real window, and understanding how to use it deliberately is one of the most powerful tools available for behavioral transformation. The relationship between repetition and difficulty also deserves honest attention, because there is a quality of repetition that matters enormously and rarely gets discussed. Effortful repetition, the kind that is done consciously, with attention, with genuine engagement, builds the automatic pattern faster and more durably than passive repetition. The musician who practices a phrase with deliberate attention to each note, who listens carefully to the quality of each repetition, who engages fully with the task rather than going through the motions, develops the automatic skill faster than the musician who logs the same number of hours in a dissociated, unfocused way. This does not mean that early habit formation requires intense concentration at every moment, but it does mean that the quality of your early repetitions, the degree to which you are actually present in the behavior rather than mentally elsewhere, affects how efficiently the automatic pattern forms. There is as well a time dimension to repetition that is more nuanced than most people realize. People often ask, how long does it take to form a habit? The honest answer is that it depends enormously on the complexity of the behavior, the consistency of the context, the presence and quality of reward, and the individual. Research suggests a range that spans from a few weeks to many months, with the average somewhere around 2 months for relatively simple daily behaviors in a stable context. But the more important truth is that asking how long it takes is often the wrong question. It implies a finish line, a point at which the habit is complete and no further attention is required. In reality, habits are not binary, either formed or not formed. They exist on a continuum of automaticity, becoming gradually more effortless with each additional repetition, becoming gradually more fragile with each extended gap. The better question is not, when will this be a habit, but what can I do to make the next repetition as likely as possible? Because each next repetition is in itself the mechanism by which the habit continues to form and deepen. Perhaps the most profound thing that repetition does, and this takes time to fully appreciate, is that it changes what feels normal. This is not a small thing. The sense of normalcy, of what is comfortable and familiar, of what the day feels wrong without, this is one of the most powerful behavioral forces there is. The behaviors that feel normal to you right now feel that way because you have done them many times in consistent contexts. They were not always normal. There was a first time for all of them. But repetition, over time, transforms the new into the familiar, and the familiar into the expected. And the expected, when absent, generates a discomfort, a feeling of something missing that motivates behavior at a level far deeper than conscious choice. This is the ultimate destination of the repetition journey. Not just an automatic behavior, not just an identity, not just a skill, but a new normal. A restructured sense of what a good day looks and feels like. A baseline against which the absence of the habit registers as a genuine loss rather than a welcome relief. You are not there yet in the early days of any new behavior, but every repetition is a step toward it. And the person who understands this, who knows that they are not just doing a thing but constructing a new relationship with normalcy, one repetition at a time, has a fundamentally different experience of the difficult early stage. Not easier, necessarily, but meaningful in a way that difficulty alone never is. Do it today, do it tomorrow. Do it in the same context, following the same cues, in the same sequence. Do not wait to feel like it, because the feeling will follow the doing, not precede it. Do not wait until the conditions are perfect, because perfect conditions are a story the old normal tells to protect itself. Do it imperfectly, incompletely, on the days when it feels pointless, and on the days when it feels wonderful, and especially on the ordinary days when it feels like neither. Let the repetition accumulate. Let the automatic system do its patient, invisible work. and trust that somewhere ahead, past a threshold you cannot see from here, but that every repetition is moving you toward, the effort will lighten and the behavior will settle and the new normal will arrive, quietly, completely, and permanently. That is what repetition does. That is all it takes, and that is everything. Chapter 6. The Science of Reward. There is something happening in your brain right now that you almost certainly do not notice, and that you have almost certainly never been taught to pay attention to, but that is quietly and continuously shaping every decision you make, every behavior you sustain, and every habit you either build or fail to build. It is not a feeling exactly, though it produces feelings. It is not a thought, though it influences thoughts. It is a chemical signal, one of the most ancient and fundamental in the entire nervous system. And it fires not when you receive something good, but in the moment just before, when your brain predicts that something good is coming. It fires in anticipation. It fires in possibility. It fires in the gap between wanting and having. And it is that gap, that exquisite space of expected reward, that drives more human behavior than any conscious intention ever has. The chemical is dopamine, and understanding what it actually does, which is quite different from what most people have been told it does, is one of the most illuminating things you can do if you want to understand why habits form, why they persist, why they sometimes refuse to form, no matter how hard you try, and how to work with the reward system rather than against it. Dopamine is commonly described as the brain's pleasure chemical. Take a bite of something delicious, receive an unexpected compliment, finish a piece of work you are proud of. Dopamine floods the system, you feel good, and the brain notes that the action that preceded the pleasant feeling is worth remembering and repeating. In this simple model, reward follows behavior, and the pleasant feeling stamps the behavior in, making it more likely to occur again. This model is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that misses the most interesting and practically important parts of what reward actually does. The revision to the simple model came from a series of experiments with a finding so counterintuitive that it took years for the scientific community to fully integrate it. Researchers were studying dopamine activity in the brains of animals being trained with food rewards. The setup was simple. The animal hears a tone, performs a behavior, receives a food pellet. Initially, dopamine fired when the food arrived, a classic reward signal confirming the pleasure model. But as the training continued and the animal learned that the tone reliably predicted the food, something changed. The dopamine signal began to migrate. Instead of firing at the moment of reward, it began firing at the moment the tone sounded, at the moment of prediction, at the signal that reward was coming before the reward had arrived at all. And when the food arrived as expected, there was almost no additional dopamine response. The brain had already spent its anticipation. Then came the most revealing part. When the researchers occasionally withheld the expected food after the tone, the dopamine response did not simply return to baseline. It dropped below baseline. A negative signal, a prediction error, a neurological notation that something expected did not arrive. The brain was not just responding to pleasure. It was running a continuous prediction model, comparing expected outcomes to actual outcomes and generating dopamine surges when reality exceeded predictions and dopamine drops when it fell short. What was being reinforced was not the pleasure itself, but the accuracy of the prediction and the motivation to pursue the thing that had been predicted. This reframing changes everything about how we understand reward in the context of habit formation. If dopamine fires in anticipation rather than in reception, then what sustains a habit is not the pleasure of the outcome, but the anticipation of it, the brain's learned expectation that this behavior, in this context, will produce something worth having. The habit is maintained not because the reward keeps feeling good, but because the prediction keeps firing. This is why habits can persist long after the initial pleasure has faded. Why the morning coffee drinker reaches for the cup, not primarily for the taste, but for the deeply ingrained anticipatory signal that fires the moment the alarm goes off or the coffee maker begins to bubble. A signal that was conditioned over hundreds of mornings until the context itself became the reward trigger, independent of the coffee's actual quality on any given day. It is also why habits built on powerful, consistent rewards form faster and more robustly than habits built on weak or inconsistent ones. The brain needs enough signal to build a strong, predictive model. If the reward is subtle, delayed, or variable in quality, the prediction signal is harder to establish, the anticipatory dopamine is weaker, and the automatic pull toward the behavior is correspondingly less powerful. This is one of the central challenges of building healthy habits. Many of the behaviors with the greatest long-term benefits produce rewards that are small, delayed, or difficult for the brain to register with enough clarity to build a strong anticipatory signal. Exercise feels uncomfortable for the first 20 minutes. Saving money feels like deprivation. Meditation feels like restless pointlessness to a beginner. The long-term rewards are real and significant, but they are exactly the kind of diffuse, delayed, conceptually mediated rewards that the automatic system, which evolved in an environment of immediate and concrete consequences, finds most difficult to learn from. This is not a design flaw. It is a mismatch between the ancient learning architecture of the automatic system and the modern world it now has to navigate. The automatic system learned to predict food, warmth, social belonging, physical safety, immediate and concrete goods. It did not evolve to feel the reward of a retirement account growing or the cumulative benefit of 10 years of consistent exercise. These are real goods, but they are goods that require the conscious mind to understand, and the conscious mind, as we have established, does not run habits. The automatic system runs habits, and the automatic system responds to reward signals that it can register, specific, clear, ideally immediate, and reliably associated with the behavior. Understanding this suggests a practical answer to one of the most common problems in habit formation. How do you build automatic patterns around behaviors whose natural rewards are long delayed or subjectively difficult to feel? The answer is not to wait for the long-term reward to arrive and hope the automatic system eventually notices. The answer is to engineer an early reward, something the brain can register now, in the window close enough to the behavior that the associative learning system can form a clear link. This engineering does not need to be elaborate. A person trying to establish a daily running habit might, in the early weeks before the physical benefits are reliably felt, pair the run with something genuinely enjoyable. A podcast they save exclusively for running time, a route through a part of their neighborhood they find beautiful, a coffee stop afterward that marks the completion of the run as an occasion. None of these rewards are the reason to run, but they provide a signal the automatic system can actually detect in the early stages of habit formation before the intrinsic rewards, the physical energy, the psychological clarity, the runner's identity, have had time to consolidate. The scaffolding reward bridges the gap between the behavior and the point at which the behavior generates its own motivation. There is, however, a complication in this strategy that is worth understanding honestly. Extrinsic rewards, rewards that are separate from the behavior itself, added on to create motivation that the behavior does not yet naturally generate, are powerful in the early stages but fragile in the long run. When the external reward is present, behavior is high. When it is removed, behavior can drop sharply, sometimes below the level it was at before the reward was introduced, a phenomenon researchers call the over-justification effect. The classic example is the child who loves to draw and is then given small rewards for drawing. While the rewards continue, the child draws enthusiastically. When the rewards stop, the child draws less, even less than before the rewards were introduced. The extrinsic reward has, in effect, replaced the intrinsic motivation rather than supplementing it, and the child now needs external justification for a behavior that was once self-sustaining. This means that the goal of early reward engineering is not to create permanent dependence on external reinforcement, but to sustain the behavior long enough for the intrinsic rewards to take hold. The scaffold is meant to come down eventually. The bridge reward serves its purpose during the gap period and should ideally be gradually reduced as the habit deepens and the behavior begins to generate its own pull. The person who runs because of the podcast eventually runs because running is part of who they are and how their day feels complete. The podcast was the bridge, not the destination. Now, here is where reward science becomes genuinely surprising and where the practical implications for habit design become counterintuitive and powerful. Some of the most robust habits, the ones that are hardest to break, that generate the strongest anticipatory pull, that maintain their hold even in adverse conditions, are built not on consistent, predictable rewards, but on variable, unpredictable ones. Rewards that come sometimes, not always. Rewards that are surprising, that are larger or different or more pleasurable than expected. This pattern of reward, called variable ratio reinforcement in behavioral science, produces stronger and more durable behavior than any consistent reward schedule. The mechanism is exactly what the dopamine research would predict. When reward is consistent and predictable, the dopamine signal migrates entirely to the prediction cue and barely registers at the moment of reward itself. The brain has already spent its anticipation. The behavior is maintained but without high intensity. But when reward is variable, when it comes sometimes, unexpectedly, in amounts that are not precisely predictable, the brain cannot fully model the prediction, and so it cannot migrate the dopamine signal entirely to the cue. Each time the behavior occurs, there is still a meaningful probability that the reward will arrive in a way that exceeds expectation, and so the anticipatory signal remains active and intense. The brain stays engaged. The pull remains strong. This is, not coincidentally, the precise mechanism that makes gambling so difficult to stop, social media so compulsive, and slot machines so psychologically devastating. Variable reward schedules are not a discovery being applied to habit formation. They are a mechanism being exploited in the design of addictive systems because engineers have understood their power to sustain behavior long before behavioral scientists found language for it. The recognition of this mechanism should not make you cynical, but it should make you thoughtful about where in your life you are being behaviorally hijacked by systems that have been deliberately engineered to activate your reward circuitry with the precise irregularity that makes the pull most difficult to resist. And it should make you thoughtful in the opposite direction about how you can use the same mechanism to your own advantage, not in a manipulative way, but in the honest recognition that varying the reward associated with a behavior you are trying to build, occasionally making it a little special, occasionally surprising yourself with something that marks the repetition as more than routine, is not self-bribery. It is working with the grain of the brain's motivational architecture rather than against it. There is something else reward does in the context of habits that is rarely discussed outside of neuroscience laboratories. It shapes attention. The dopamine system does not just motivate behavior, it controls what the brain notices. When the reward signal fires, the brain becomes more attuned to the contextual cues that preceded it, more likely to notice them in the future, more likely to treat them as significant. This means that rewarded behaviors do not just become more automatic, they become more perceptually salient. The cues that trigger them begin to stand out in the environment in a way that cues for unrewarded behaviors do not. The coffee drinker does not just automatically reach for the cup. They notice the smell of coffee in a way that non-coffee drinkers do not, because the reward system has tuned their perceptual system to be alert to that cue. This attentional shaping has a dark side. The cues associated with harmful habits become, through the reward system, among the most perceptually salient features of the environment. The person trying to stop smoking does not just have a behavioral pattern to overcome. They have a perceptual system that has been tuned through thousands of repetitions of a rewarded behavior to notice cigarettes, cigarette imagery, smoking contexts, and social situations associated with smoking more prominently than people who have never smoked notice these things. The cues are not just neutral triggers that happen to activate a behavior. They are features of the environment that the reward system has made impossible to ignore. This is part of why changing context, genuinely removing yourself from the cue environment, is so important in the process of changing entrenched behaviors. The cues themselves are not neutral. They have been made meaningful by reward, and their meaningfulness persists long after the behavior has stopped. Understanding reward this way, not as a simple pleasure bonus added to behavior, but as the mechanism by which the automatic system identifies, prioritizes, learns, and maintains behavior, changes what it means to take your own motivation seriously. It means understanding that the experiences you associate with your desired behaviors are not peripheral to the habit-building process. They are central to it. The quality of attention you bring to the behavior, the degree to which you notice and appreciate the immediate outcomes, the way you mark completions and acknowledge progress, all of these shape the reward signal, and through the reward signal, the strength and durability of the habit. This is also why the concept of making behaviors enjoyable is not a soft or incidental suggestion. It is neurologically serious advice. When you find a way to make a desired behavior genuinely pleasant, not through deception or distraction, but through honest attention to what is good about doing it, to the immediate satisfaction of the completion, to the small and real pleasures embedded in the activity itself, you are feeding the reward system with the signal it needs to build the anticipatory pull that makes the behavior automatic. You are not making it easier in a shallow sense. You are building it at the level of the brain's most fundamental motivational architecture. Reward is not a luxury added to good habits. It is the engine that builds them. And the person who understands this, who approaches the design of their own behavioral patterns with the same attention to reward structure that a thoughtful architect pays to load-bearing walls, is working with the deepest and most powerful forces in human motivation, rather than trying to override them with a resolution and a good intention. The brain wants to learn. It wants to build efficient patterns. It wants to anticipate good outcomes and move toward them. Give it a clear, consistent, meaningful reward, and it will do the rest. Give it enough repetitions with enough signal, and the behavior will become automatic, not because you forced it, but because the brain recognized it as worth keeping. And a habit that the brain has decided is worth keeping is one that almost nothing can take away. Chapter 7. The Architecture of Consistency. There is a kind of person who starts things beautifully. You may know someone like this, or you may recognize yourself in the description. They begin with extraordinary energy. The new exercise routine, the writing practice, the meditation, the dietary change, and for the first 2 or 3 weeks, something genuinely impressive is happening. They are showing up. They are doing the work. They are feeling the momentum of a life that is finally, actually changing. And then life happens. A difficult week at work, a disruption to the normal schedule, a social obligation that shifts the timing, a day where the energy is low and the effort required feels disproportionate to the motivation available, and the streak breaks. And something else breaks with it, something less visible but more consequential. The narrative of the attempt begins to shift from "I am building this" to "I was trying to build this," and the trying somehow is already past tense. What failed here was not motivation. In most cases, the motivation was entirely real. What failed was not commitment. The commitment was genuine when it was made. What failed was the architecture. The structure within which the behavior was supposed to occur was not built for the actual conditions of a real human life, a life that is inconsistent, interrupted, uneven in its demands, frequently divergent from the ideal conditions imagined at the moment of enthusiastic beginning. The behavior was placed inside a fragile structure, and the structure did not hold when the weather turned. Consistency is not a personality trait. This is one of the most important things to understand about it, because the belief that it is a personality trait, that some people are naturally consistent and others are not, that consistency is something you either have or you do not, is one of the primary reasons people give up on building it. Consistency is an outcome. It is the result of structural conditions that make showing up easier than not showing up, that reduce the friction between intention and action, that build the repetition into the architecture of the day rather than leaving it to the mercy of daily motivation. The consistently consistent person is not, in most cases, exercising extraordinary willpower every day. They have built a life in which the consistent behavior is the path of least resistance, where the environment, the social commitments, the timing, the cues, and the routines all combine to make doing the thing less effortful than not doing it. This is a profound reframe, because it means that the question of how to become more consistent is not primarily a question about your psychology or your character or your level of determination. It is primarily a question about your architecture. How have you built your day? Where have you placed the behavior in relation to the existing stable structures of your life? What happens when the conditions are imperfect? When the routine is disrupted? When the motivation is absent? When the easy version of the behavior is not available? Have you built a structure that holds in those conditions, or have you built a structure that only works when everything goes according to plan? To understand what a consistent architecture actually looks like, it helps to think about the difference between behaviors that are decision-dependent and behaviors that are structure-dependent. A decision-dependent behavior is one that requires a fresh conscious choice each time it occurs. Every morning you decide whether to exercise. Every afternoon you decide whether to work on the creative project. Every evening you decide whether to spend money wisely or impulsively. Each of these decisions draws from the conscious system, the deliberate, effortful, depletable system that also happens to be the one most vulnerable to fatigue, stress, distraction, and the simple accumulation of a difficult day. Decision-dependent behaviors are fragile by design because they require the conscious system to be engaged and functional at exactly the moment the behavior is supposed to occur. A structure-dependent behavior, by contrast, is one that has been embedded so thoroughly into the stable routines and environmental cues of daily life that it requires minimal fresh decision-making to initiate. The behavior happens not because you decided to do it in that moment, but because the structure of the day delivers you to it, because the context cues fire, because the preceding behavior in a reliable sequence has always been followed by this one. The decision, in effect, was made in advance, in the moment of designing the structure, and the daily execution of that decision requires almost none of the conscious effort that would be required if the choice were fresh each time. The most durable habits in any person's life are almost always structure-dependent. Think about the behaviors you do most reliably, the ones that have not wavered in years, that you perform even on your worst days, that do not require you to be motivated or energized or at your best. In virtually every case, those behaviors are embedded in a stable, recurring structure that delivers you to them without requiring fresh, deliberate choice. They are anchored to a time, a place, a sequence, a social context that makes their occurrence the default rather than the exception. The science of habit formation offers a precise name for the mechanism by which structure-dependent behaviors are built: implementation intentions. An implementation intention is not a goal. It is not a statement of what you want to achieve, but a specific statement of when, where, and how a behavior will occur. The difference seems small, but the behavioral evidence is striking. Across dozens of studies and many behavioral domains, people who form specific implementation intentions, not "I will exercise more," but "I will exercise at 7 in the morning on weekdays, immediately after I make coffee, in the space I have cleared in the living room," show dramatically higher rates of behavior completion than people with identical goals and identical motivation who have not formed implementation intentions. The mechanism is simple and powerful. A specific implementation intention preloads the decision into the structure of the day. When the specified context arrives, the time, the place, the preceding behavior, the implementation intention activates, and the behavior follows with minimal need for fresh deliberation. The context has been linked to the behavior in advance through an explicit commitment that functions like an artificial habit cue before the natural habit cue has had time to form through repetition. Over time, as the behavior is repeated consistently in that context, the artificial cue is replaced by the natural one. The automatic system takes over the triggering function, and the implementation intention is no longer consciously needed. But in the early stages, it provides exactly the structural bridge that transforms a vague intention into a specific, executable plan. The detail of specificity here matters enormously. The vaguer the intention, the more decision-making is required at the moment of execution. "I will exercise more" leaves every detail open. When, where, what kind, for how long, after what, before what. Each of these open details is a micro-decision that must be made in the moment, drawing on the conscious system's limited resources in the very conditions, early morning, post-work fatigue, busy schedule, where that system is most likely to find reasons not to proceed. The more of these decisions that have been made in advance and embedded in a specific structure, the less the conscious system is burdened at the moment of execution, and the more likely the behavior is to occur regardless of the day's conditions. This is also why the habit stacking technique, attaching a new behavior to an existing, highly stable behavior, is so structurally effective. When you anchor a new behavior to something you already do with near perfect consistency, you are borrowing the structural stability of the existing habit to support the new one. The existing habit provides the implementation context for free, the time, the place, the cue, without requiring you to design a new structure from scratch. You are inserting the new behavior into an already running program, using the established cue-response relationship of the old habit to trigger the initiation of the new one. Over time, the new behavior builds its own automatic associations. But in the critical early period, the borrowed structure provides the consistency scaffold that repetition needs in order to accumulate. Now here is where consistency architecture becomes genuinely interesting, and where most people make a critical error. The tendency, when designing a new habit structure, is to design for the best version of the day. You imagine yourself at your most energetic, most organized, most motivated, and you design a behavior that suits that person. The run is an hour long. The writing session is 2 hours, first thing in the morning, before anything else. The meal preparation is elaborate and thoughtful. The meditation is 30 minutes of careful, dedicated practice. These are beautiful intentions, and on the best days they may even be executed. But they are not architected for consistency. They are architected for optimal performance on the days that optimal performance is available. The problem is that optimal performance is not the majority of days. The majority of days are ordinary, slightly difficult, often interrupted, regularly imperfect. And a structure designed for optimal days will fail on ordinary days, meaning it will fail most of the time. A structure designed for ordinary days, by contrast, one that is achievable even when you are tired, even when time is short, even when motivation is low, will succeed most of the time. And an imperfect behavior performed most of the time is incomparably more powerful for habit formation than a perfect behavior performed occasionally. This is the principle of the minimum viable repetition. For any behavior you are trying to make consistent, there is a version of it that is so small, so brief, so achievable in even the worst conditions that the barrier to doing it on a bad day is essentially zero. For exercise, it might be 10 minutes. Not the full workout, just the minimum that keeps the pattern alive and the cue-response association intact. For writing, it might be a single paragraph. Not the full session, just enough to touch the practice and maintain the chain of repetitions. The minimum viable version is not the goal. It is the floor. On good days, you go well beyond it. On hard days, you do only it. And because you always do at least it, the streak continues, the pattern remains intact, and the consistency accumulates. The consistency of the floor matters more than the quality of the ceiling. A person who does 10 minutes every single day without exception will build a more durable automatic pattern than a person who does an hour on some days and nothing on others. Not because 10 minutes provides a better physical stimulus, but because 10 minutes every day provides an unbroken chain of context behavior associations that the automatic system can build a reliable pattern from. The hour and nothing person has a performance. The 10 minutes always person has a habit. There is also a social dimension to consistency architecture that is powerful enough to deserve explicit attention. Social commitments around behavior, the running partner, the class with a set time, the accountability group, the friend you have told about your goal. Add a layer of structural support to consistency that is qualitatively different from private commitment. Private commitment depends entirely on your own internal resources at the moment of execution. Social commitment adds an external cost to non-performance, the cost of explaining an absence, of disrupting someone else's plan, of failing a commitment that exists in the social world rather than only in your own mind. This external cost does not work by making you feel bad about yourself. It works by changing the structural calculation at the moment of decision. Without the social commitment, the question your automatic system is implicitly asking is doing this behavior easier than not doing it right now? With the social commitment, the question becomes, is doing this behavior plus the cost of explaining my absence to someone else easier than just doing it? The addition of the social cost tilts the balance significantly toward doing, not because the behavior has become more pleasurable, but because not doing it has become more costly. And this structural shift in the cost-benefit architecture of the moment does not require willpower to maintain. It is simply there, doing its work, regardless of your motivational state on any given day. But consistency architecture is not only about the behaviors you want to add, it is equally, and perhaps more urgently, about the environments and structures around the behaviors you want to reduce or eliminate. Just as the path to a desired behavior can be smoothed by removing friction, the path to an undesired behavior can be made more resistant by adding it. The friction you build around unhealthy or unproductive behaviors is, in a very practical sense, the same mechanism as the friction you remove from the healthy ones, just running in the opposite direction. Uninstall the app. Keep the food out of the house. Put distance between yourself and the queue. Make the undesired behavior require an active decision, a physical effort, a social cost. Anything that transforms it from the default option into something that requires genuine, deliberate choice to pursue. This asymmetric friction design, reducing friction for desired behaviors, adding it for undesired ones, is the most reliable architectural approach to reshaping the behavioral landscape of your daily life. It does not require you to be at your best. It does not require daily renewal of motivation. It does not depend on willpower surviving intact through a demanding day. It works in the background through the simple physics of making some things easier and other things harder, leveraging the automatic system's deep preference for the path of least resistance in the direction you have deliberately chosen. The architecture of consistency is, at its heart, a form of respect. Respect for the reality of human psychology, for the finiteness of conscious effort, for the genuine difficulty of being the person you want to be when the conditions are against you. It does not demand that you become someone who never struggles, never wavers, never has a day where the last thing you want to do is the thing you know you should. It demands only that you build a structure around your most important behaviors that makes it more likely, not certain but meaningfully more likely, that even the version of you having a terrible Thursday will still show up, still do the minimum, still keep the chain unbroken. That version of you, the tired, imperfect, showing up anyway version, is building something that the inspired, motivated, early days version never could. They are building consistency itself, and consistency, accumulated patiently over months and then years in the unremarkable ordinary days rather than the extraordinary ones, is the material from which durable lives are made. Chapter 8. Breaking the Cycle, Fresh Starts, and Boundless Resilience. There is a strange, unsettling quiet that accompanies the first morning in a newly rented apartment or a recently purchased home. You wake up, and for a fraction of a second your brain does not know where you are. The ceiling looks different. The light filtering through the window falls at an unfamiliar angle. As you stumble out of bed, your body reaches for a light switch that is not there, your hand brushing against empty drywall. You walk into the kitchen, only to realize your coffee maker is still buried inside a cardboard box, labeled with thick black marker. Every single action that was completely automatic just 24 hours ago now requires conscious, deliberate thought. You have to actively decide where to find a mug, how to navigate the unfamiliar route to your new office, and which grocery store to visit on the way home. It is disorienting, exhausting, and profoundly beautiful. This feeling of displacement is what we call a fresh start, and it is one of the most powerful, fleeting windows of opportunity in the human experience. Most of us spend our lives trying to change our behavior while remaining firmly planted in the exact same environments that created our unwanted behaviors in the first place. We try to become entirely new people while sitting at the exact same desk, driving the exact same commute, and sleeping in the exact same room. We fight a grueling battle against invisible forces, relying entirely on willpower to overcome the relentless, silent triggers of our daily context. But when life introduces a major disruption, a relocation, a change in career, the arrival of a new child, or even a significant shift in a daily schedule, the invisible architecture of your old habits is suddenly completely dismantled. Think deeply about what happens when someone relocates to a new city for a demanding job. In their old life, perhaps they had fallen into a deep rut of sluggishness. Every evening, their old commute took them past their favorite fast food drive-thru, and their old living room was perfectly arranged to swallow them into a plush sofa right in front of a massive television. They might have spent years fighting those cues, berating themselves for not having the discipline to drive past the restaurant or turn off the screen. But now, in the new city, that specific drive-thru does not exist on their route. The plush sofa is sitting in a storage unit or perhaps was left behind entirely. The environmental friction that kept them trapped in their old routine has vanished overnight. This disruption is a golden window, a brief period where the autopilot has been forced to shut down. The brain is highly alert, scanning the new environment, trying to figure out how to navigate this novel terrain. Because the old cues are missing, the person is no longer fighting the powerful undertow of their past habits. If this person recognizes the immense power of this moment, they can intentionally construct a completely new reality. They can choose a route home from the new office that passes a local park instead of a restaurant. They can set up their new living room with a comfortable reading chair facing a window, placing the television in a spare room or a less central location. By actively designing the new environment before the brain has a chance to settle into an unconscious rhythm, they can install healthy, vibrant habits with a fraction of the effort it would have taken in their old life. However, this window of conscious design does not stay open forever. The human brain craves efficiency and predictability. It cannot sustain the high energy costs of conscious decision-making for very long. If you do not actively design your new routines during a life disruption, your brain will simply grab on to whatever is easiest and most immediate, quickly forging new habits out of pure convenience. If you leave your running shoes packed away and simply fall onto the nearest available chair after work, a new, potentially destructive habit will begin to cement itself within weeks. The fresh start is a neutral, rapidly hardening clay. You must shape it intentionally before it sets. This leads us to the other side of the behavioral coin, the boundless resilience of a habit once that clay has fully hardened. We often talk about the stubbornness of bad habits, lamenting how hard they are to break, but we rarely celebrate the incredible protective armor that this same resilience provides for our good habits. When you have spent months or years successfully repeating a positive action in a stable context, locking it into your procedural memory through consistent rewards, that behavior becomes extraordinarily tough to destroy. Imagine a person who has spent 3 years cultivating a deep, restorative morning writing habit. Every day at 6 in the morning, they sit at the same wooden desk, brew the same dark roast coffee, and write for exactly 1 hour before the rest of the house wakes up. The context is perfectly tuned, the repetition is solidified, and the intrinsic reward of creative expression is deeply felt. Then, life delivers a devastating blow. Perhaps a family member falls gravely ill, plunging this person's life into emotional turmoil and logistical chaos. Their conscious mind is entirely consumed by grief, stress, medical appointments, and overwhelming anxiety. Their willpower is completely depleted. They have absolutely no energy left to force themselves to do anything productive. If writing were merely a goal, a fragile intention relying on motivation, it would be the first thing to disappear. But because writing has become a deeply ingrained habit, the opposite happens. The habit actually protects the individual. When 6 in the morning rolls around, the familiar environmental cues, the quiet house, the wooden desk, the smell of the coffee, act as an irresistible gravitational pull. The person does not need to decide to write. They find themselves sitting at the desk almost automatically. The habit operates beneath the level of their grief and exhaustion. The familiar sequence of brewing coffee and typing words becomes an anchor in a storm, a rare moment of predictability and peace in a world that has otherwise turned upside down. This is the ultimate promise of habit formation. It is not about turning yourself into a rigid machine. It is about building a psychological sanctuary that sustains you when your conscious mind is too battered to steer the ship. When we understand the profound resilience of habits, we realize that the effort we put into shaping them during our fresh starts is the greatest investment we can ever make in our future selves. We are constructing the invisible scaffolding that will hold us up when our motivation inevitably collapses. The interplay between disruptions and resilience teaches us a profound lesson about personal transformation. We do not need to wait for a cross-country move or a major life event to manufacture a fresh start. We can create micro-disruptions in our own lives by intentionally altering our environments. Rearranging a room, completely changing the layout of the apps on a smartphone, or deliberately altering a daily commuting route can provide just enough friction to wake the brain up from its unconscious slumber. By strategically introducing novelty into stale environments, we force our autopilot to disengage, giving our conscious mind the brief, precious opportunity to step in and redirect the course of our actions. Yet, as we navigate these windows of change and marvel at the resilience of the human brain, we must also confront a darker truth. The exact same neurological machinery that makes a morning writing routine virtually indestructible is also responsible for behaviors that can completely consume a human life. When the contextual triggers, the repetition, and the dopamine rewards become overwhelmingly intense, the resilience of a habit can mutate into something deeply destructive. To fully master the forces that shape our behavior, we must dare to look into the shadows and understand what happens when the autopilot goes dangerously off course. Chapter 9. The Dark Side of Habit. Understanding and Overcoming Addiction. There is a profound and uncomfortable truth we must face about the human mind. The exact same neurological machinery that allows us to build a beautiful, productive life is also capable of destroying it. Up until this point, we have celebrated the incredible power of the subconscious to automate our behaviors, reduce our mental fatigue, and carry us toward our highest goals even when our willpower is completely depleted. We have marveled at the resilience of good habits, but that very resilience, that unyielding durability, has a shadow. When the loop of context, repetition, and reward is hijacked by behaviors that harm us, the resulting habit does not just hold us steady, it traps us. This is the dark side of our procedural memory. This is where we must talk about addiction, compulsions, and the overwhelming force of habits that seem entirely out of our conscious control. To truly understand how this happens, we have to look past the conventional wisdom that treats addiction purely as a failure of moral character or a simple lack of discipline. Think about someone you might know who has struggled deeply with a destructive behavior. Perhaps it was a compulsion to gamble away their savings, or a nightly reliance on alcohol that slowly eroded their health and relationships. If you watch this person closely, you will see something heartbreaking. You will see a person who desperately wants to stop. You will hear them make passionate, tearful promises to themselves and their loved ones that tomorrow will be different. And in those moments of conscious reflection, they mean every single word. Their rational brain, their executive function, is screaming for a change. Yet, when tomorrow comes, they find themselves repeating the exact same destructive action, almost as if they are watching themselves do it from the outside, powerless to intervene. This happens because the addiction has burrowed so deeply into the habit-forming architecture of the brain that it bypasses the conscious mind entirely. Remember how we discussed the way dopamine works? It is a chemical messenger that flags an experience as important, stamping it into our memory. With highly addictive behaviors, the dopamine spike is unnaturally massive. It floods the system, creating a blazing neon sign in the brain that says, whatever you just did, you must do it again at all costs. Over time, through repetition, the brain starts to release that dopamine not just when the person engages in the behavior, but the moment they encounter the context associated with it. The environment itself becomes a relentless trigger. Imagine a man who has spent 10 years winding down from a stressful corporate job by pouring a heavy drink the exact moment he walks through his front door. After a health scare, he vows to quit. He attends meetings, reads books, and builds up a formidable fortress of willpower. To clear his head, he takes a month-long leave of absence and goes to a remote cabin in the mountains. For 30 days, surrounded by hiking trails, fresh air, and absolute quiet, he does not have a single drop. He feels completely cured. His conscious mind feels victorious. He believes he has finally slain the dragon. But then his leave ends. He flies back to the city, rides the elevator up to his apartment, and turns the key in the lock. The moment the door swings open, the familiar smell of his hallway hits him. He sees the specific dim lighting of his living room and hears the hum of his refrigerator. Before he can even process a conscious thought, a physical, visceral craving hits him so hard it buckles his knees. His failure in that moment is not a failure of character. It is a testament to the terrifying efficiency of his habit memory. His brain learned perfectly that the combination of that specific door, that specific lighting, and the end of a workday meant an immediate, massive reward. While he was away in the mountains, his willpower was not actually being tested against his habit because the context was entirely missing. The moment he returned to the original environment, the silent automated machinery of his second self powered up and overrode his rational intentions in a fraction of a second. This is the tragedy of addiction. The brain is actually working exactly as it was designed to, but it has learned a lesson that is killing the host. Understanding this context-driven nature of addiction changes absolutely everything about how we fight back. If the environment is pulling the strings, then sheer mental fortitude will never be enough to win a prolonged war. Willpower is a finite resource, a cavalry charge that eventually tires out, whereas the environmental cues are permanent, silent, and infinitely patient. To break a deeply ingrained destructive loop, you cannot just try to outthink it or outsuffer it. You have to dismantle the machinery. You have to aggressively and sometimes radically change the context. If you are trying to break a powerful compulsion, you must become a ruthless architect of your surroundings. You have to look at your daily life and identify the invisible tripwires that send your brain into autopilot. If your phone is the source of a digital addiction that keeps you awake until 3 in the morning, relying on the willpower to not look at it while it sits on your nightstand is a losing battle. The context is too strong. You must banish the charger to the kitchen. You must change the route you take home from work if it leads you past the places where you used to engage in your destructive habits. You must sometimes change the people you spend your time with because human beings are the most powerful contextual cues of all. This process of dismantling the environment is incredibly difficult, and it requires a deep well of self-compassion. It means accepting that your conscious mind is not always the undisputed master of your actions. But in that surrender lies your ultimate liberation. By recognizing that you are fighting an automated system rather than a personal demon, you can stop relying on guilt and shame. You can replace self-flagellation with strategy. You can begin to build new, healthy contexts that slowly, day by day, teach your brain a different lesson. The path out of the dark side of habit is not through brute force, but through the patient, deliberate restructuring of the world you live in, creating a space where the right choices are finally allowed to become the easy ones. Chapter 10. The Habitual Path to Happiness and Community. We have spent our time together dissecting the mechanics of the human mind, dismantling the myth of willpower, and learning how to engineer our environments for success. But as we reach the end of this journey, we must ask a fundamental question. What is all this efficiency actually for? If we spend our days optimizing our routines, constructing perfectly frictionless environments, and handing our daily choices over to our subconscious autopilot, what is the ultimate goal? The answer lies in how we define a good life. For a very long time, our culture has sold us a vision of happiness that is inherently exhausting. We are taught to imagine happiness as a sudden, massive spike in emotion, the thrill of a spontaneous cross-country road trip, the explosive joy of a massive promotion, or the cinematic romance of a grand, unexpected gesture. We chase these towering peaks, believing that if we can just string enough of them together, we will finally be happy. But if you look closely at a life lived entirely in pursuit of emotional spikes, you will often find a profound, underlying exhaustion. Chasing the extraordinary requires a tremendous amount of conscious decision-making. It demands endless planning, constant evaluation, and a relentless exertion of willpower. The friction of living this way eventually grinds the spirit down. True, enduring happiness is rarely found in the peaks. It is found in the plateaus. It is found in the quiet, steady rhythm of a life where your daily actions naturally align with your deepest values, and where those actions happen so automatically that they require zero internal debate. Consider a man who spent the entirety of his 20s terrified of routine. He equated predictability with a lack of passion. Every few years he changed cities, changed careers, and dismantled his social circles, always seeking a fresh high. For a while, the adrenaline sustained him, but slowly, the weight of constant reinvention took its toll. Because absolutely nothing in his life was automated, every single day required 1,000 conscious decisions. Where to buy groceries, how to get to work, who to call for support. His cognitive load was perpetually maxed out. By his early 30s, he was not living a life of passion, he was living a life of profound anxiety and burnout. Eventually, out of sheer exhaustion, he stopped running. He rented a modest apartment and signed a long-term lease. He began waking up at the exact same time every morning. He walked his dog along the exact same 2-mile loop. He ate the same simple breakfast. At first, his conscious mind rebelled against the mundane predictability of it all. It felt like defeat. But as the months passed, the magic of procedural memory began to take hold. His morning routine shifted to the automated machinery of his second self. He no longer had to decide to walk the dog or debate what to cook. And in that newfound mental silence, a miracle occurred. Because his survival and daily maintenance were handled entirely by his habits, his conscious mind was suddenly free. For the first time in his life, while walking the same familiar path, he actually had the mental bandwidth to watch the sunrise, to feel the cool morning air on his skin, and to experience a deep, spontaneous surge of gratitude. By automating the ordinary, he had finally made space to truly experience the extraordinary. This is the ultimate gift of a well-crafted habit. When our beneficial behaviors run on autopilot, the crippling stress of decision fatigue evaporates. We are no longer constantly negotiating with ourselves, fighting our own worst impulses, or berating ourselves for our failures. We achieve a state of internal peace. But this profound stillness does not stop at the edge of our own minds. The beauty of human existence is that we do not live in isolation. We are deeply intertwined, and our behaviors ripple outward to shape the world around us. Just as a single contextual cue can trigger a habit within you, you act as a powerful contextual cue for everyone in your life. We are incredibly social creatures, and our routines are remarkably contagious. When you build a stable, positive architecture for yourself, you unconsciously introduce a stabilizing gravitational pull into the lives of your family, your friends, and your colleagues. You become the environment. Think about a workplace that has fallen into a collective loop of toxic stress. The culture is built on late-night emails, skipped lunches, and a frantic, reactive energy. Everyone is utterly exhausted, yet they all continue the behavior because it is the established norm. It is a shared bad habit. Now imagine that one person decides to break the cycle. They silence their phone at 6 o'clock every evening. They begin taking a real, uninterrupted lunch break, leaving the building to eat on a park bench. For the first week, they are the outlier, viewed with suspicion, but they do not preach or lecture. They simply remain perfectly consistent. Without saying a word, they have fundamentally altered the visual cues in the office. Every day at noon, their empty desk signals a different possibility. Soon, a deeply burnt-out co-worker tentatively joins them on the park bench. Then another. By automating their own well-being, the first person lowered the friction for everyone else to do the same. They did not change the corporate policy through sheer willpower. They changed the culture by introducing a new, healthy habit into the shared social ecosystem. This same dynamic plays out in our homes. The routines you establish under your own roof become the invisible architecture that supports your family. When you automatically prioritize a calm morning routine, or when you instinctively respond to conflict with a deep breath and a measured tone, you are not just managing your own behavior. You are providing a safe, predictable context for your partner and your children. You are teaching them, through silent repetition, what a healthy life looks and feels like. The journey of understanding and mastering your habits is not a lonely, white-knuckled fight against your own nature. It is the gentle, persistent construction of a better reality. You now know that relying on brute force willpower is a game you are destined to lose. You understand that the true power lies in shaping your environment, honoring the need for repetition, and respecting the neurochemistry of reward. When you align your hidden autopilot with your highest aspirations, you do far more than just save yourself. You create a sanctuary of stability in a chaotic world. You become a living, breathing testament to human resilience, proving day by day, action by automated action, that a better, more joyful life is entirely within our reach.